Well, good evening, Melissa. I'm super happy to meet with you today and talk about your residency in Skovde, Sweden. Melissa Shaginoff is part of the caribou and fish eater clans from Chickaloon Village. She's an Ahtna and Paiute artist, a social activist, and curator of Alaska Pacific University's art galleries. Her work is shaped by the structure and processes of Dene ceremony, potlatch. Melissa has participated in Island Mountain Arts, Tony Onley Artist Project in Wells, British Columbia, as well as the Sheldon Jackson Museum Artist Residency in Sitka, and of course, most recently at the Skovde Museum in Skovde, Sweden. She's been published in the Alaska Humanities Forum First Magazine, First American Art Magazine, Inuit Art Quarterly, and the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center Learning Lab. Her artwork is collected by the Institute of American Indian Arts, Palmer Museum, and the Pratt Museum. Melissa is also part of Luketsetsa's Fish Head Soup, a new media group focusing on the collaboration and representation of Indigenous experiences in science fiction. She recently participated, as I mentioned, in an artist residency in social practice at the Skovde Museum. And within this residency, Melissa engaged in decolonial projects focusing on Indigenous visiting culture and framing conversations as art practice. Welcome, Melissa.
Chinan. Willie Jan, etc. Melissa Shagnos Settelan, Udzisyu Cui Ui Ticutta, Nay'dini'aa Na Kayax since Yarin, artist at curator Gogashna, Chinan Kotano Zatlan, Chinan Asia for having me.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you. I've been extremely inspired and fascinated by your art practice. I wonder if you could give us a little bit of a background on the kind of learnings that have been leading up to this residency as you've been evolving a kind of social engagement through customary arts and land acknowledgement actions. Maybe tell people about kind of where you were in your practice as you went to Sweden, some things you were thinking about.
Yeah, I think really, so I was selected for this residency 2 years ago. And so I think that I'm a very different artist than I was 2 years ago when I was selected. And sort of through that time, it was always in the back of my mind, the hopes that I would be able to go. But I kind of just pushed forward in really trying to focus on response to my community and thinking about the type of artist I want to be. I think that I'd always wanted to be a visual artist, a painter and a draftsperson. But as I moved more into, actionable things and activism, I realized that I think that what I was leaning towards is that I was leaning towards trying to develop an art practice that was about communication and understanding. And it was really through kind of my development of how I thought that I could add towards the movement of decolonization within institutions and galleries and the arts community in Alaska, particularly in Anchorage. So I developed kind of conversation as art practice, I think. I was leading these workshops in land acknowledgement and decolonization, but really trying to talk about sort of the in-between things. What makes land acknowledgement difficult? What makes it something that can be challenging, and how can we look at land acknowledgement and decolonization beyond just beyond sort of the signaling, and the performative things. It's like, how do you get to the root of why this needs to happen, and also kind of, the root of settler colonialism and and how institutions can sort of wave their land acknowledgement flag, their decall flag, and kind of still ignore the actionable things that we need to do. You know, how do we discuss those things? And I think that too, that just part of who I am, I'm like a very sensitive, sort of soft person. And that's really by design, you know, in my art practice, that I think that it takes a lot of work to be kind and to be an open person and to provide a space where people can safely talk about themselves and their culture and the things that they don't understand. And how do you, you know, use that softness to move people, you know, towards their next steps of what it is that they need to be inwardly looking into and developing. And, you know, kind of like through these 2 years of work, you know, during the pandemic and developing these ideas, I sort of always had in the back of my mind that I would be, you know, doing something similar in Sweden. In some ways, even getting the residency was the crux of this sort of like really deep understanding. When I was selected, I had done an interview with Mette and Tomas, the two curators from Cuvda that had come to Alaska to interview many artists, myself included. And, you know, when we were going through kind of the questions and I think they were making their decisions, you know, the thing that I really just wanted to sort of leave in their minds was that I was the type of artist and really the type of person who wanted to learn from them, you know, that realized that as an outsider coming into their community, that I was going to do as much as I could to not be extractive and to not just be pulling out sort of all the special things about Sweden and Cuvda that I can take with me back to Alaska, that I was actually going to try to leave something and leave something that was, you know, momentary but meaningful and, you know, kind of like gentle but also like a deep experience. And, you know, I think in Alaska, you know, any artist that is, you know, from Alaska or person from Alaska, we all understand, you know, sort of the exoticism that happens with the Arctic, right? The subarctic and people wanting to visit and have their polar bear experience and then, you know, leave with it, right? I think oftentimes we don't see many outside artists coming in and leaving something behind. And I think that that's a problem and certainly an issue that I saw as a curator in Alaska, you know. So for me, I realized that I was in this sort of special position to sort of, for the first time, kind of be that sort of outside artist coming into the community. And how do I sort of like flip that? Because we always have these like gatherings and lectures and discussions, you know, where the artist is coming in and gonna, you know, relay, you know, this brilliant idea upon a community. And in my opinion, this idea without really any sort of contextual knowledge of a community. So my whole thought behind my project in Cuvda was that I wanted to come in and I really wanted to interview and build relationship and talk with people and find out at the core of Cuvda and the core of who I was talking to, you know, who they were and how they sort of strategized being part of a community, how they strategized their stewardship and what was their knowledge of the history there. And if they would, you know, gift me that information. So, yeah, so my first kind of like project while I was there is that I developed this idea, this project that I call How to Be a Good Guest. You know, and it's really kind of in the framework within, you know, my own culture of going into someone's territory and sort of the work that you do, you know, to respect their work and respect all the things that they've done, you know, to develop their community, to care for the land. So a big part of of that was that I created this little pamphlet. And this pamphlet is kind of like a Mad Libs, where I introduce myself in it, and I have like a little description of why introductions are important in my language. I started off this, with my introduction in my Ahtna language. But then also asking them questions about themselves, things like, when you first meet someone, what would you like them to know about you? And then when you know somebody, what would you like them to understand about you? And thinking about the difference between those questions. And, if I were to meet someone beyond just the, hi, my name's this, and this is my job title, or this is my level of education, it's like, what if we were trying to take that a little step further and, ask questions that were more about, how do I know you? How do I build allegiance to you? And so I was asking people basically to answer these sort of Mad Lib style questions, these fill in the blank questions, but then also, come up with a word that, represented, something to them, that represented themselves. And then the other side was to represent, I think, place. So I actually can share my screen and show you the pamphlet and what somebody who had written in. So let me do that. Can you see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. So this was the first iteration of the draft that I did. And so what I would do, whoops, already messed it up. So what I would do is I would have these workshops in Ckovde that the curators and the school that I was next door to and the galleries that I had met and the people I'd met, I would, sort of create these little gatherings. And, we would have this conversation that felt sort of very informal of, hi, I'm Melissa, I'm coming in, and here's this sort of idea that I have. And I'd sort of kind of make a joke that it was just, so I could find like the best sushi spot in Ckovde, right? And to just try to kind of approach it in this more casual way. Because I think that when you structure sort of conversations, particularly as like an artist, who's sort of been hyped up a little bit to, our artist in residence, Melissa Shaginoff from Alaska, is coming in. I think that when you take that time that's supposed to be kind of like your time with the mic and you give it to someone else to talk about themselves, you have a deeper sort of interaction, and I think that oftentimes within institutions and within sort of institutional workshops and kind of moments like this, we don't do a lot to ask people, why they're there and who they are and, how it is that they can interact and develop this idea, So that's what I did. So that this is the pamphlet here. And you see that a lot of people answered in Swedish. And then I also have my Swinglish sort of Google translations of my descriptions, right? So the first page, you would actually, when you unfold it, the inside is right here, which is, people ask, me giving my introduction, talking about why introductions are important within sort of my cultural context, and then asking people sort of like, basic questions, right, about themselves. And then this more deeper question here. And then asking people within this sort of beadwork pattern to draw a word that would represent them, So this person picked lugn, which I believe is calm in Swedish. And so I would kind of at this moment be like, see people kind of finish up and then I'd be like, oh, would anyone like to share, what they wrote? And I would always have one that was finished by myself and I would share if nobody had shared. And it always was kind of like magic because I find that in all the sort of discussions that I lead that when you sort of lead by example and you offer a little bit of yourself, in kind of a very transparent and humble way and just a truthful way, that people recognize that and they want to commune with you and share with you back. And I never had really silent moments where, something didn't work out. There was always a moment where somebody wanted to share or to comment. And, then we ended up having these like larger conversations about Swedish culture and about how, the first group I worked with was a whole array of ages, because it was essentially like a gap year school. So it was like the school you go between high school and college to decide if you want to really pursue the arts. And so you had, students who were 18 and then students who were 65 and going for their second career, or who were in retirement and just wanted to, try out painting. And so it was interesting, kind of like the levels of answers we'd have. There was a young student who would talk about, Sweden seems like a really lonely place to me. And, I wonder, why people like live alone and don't really, interact as much. Right. And then there'd be, other people who, older people who would also talk about, well, that kind of comes from this time period in Sweden. And I learned more about Swedish history than I ever expected, and not from anything that I read or any sort of like directed research. It was really just from, kind of people picking away, why they felt these certain things about their community or about, themselves, really. Sorry, I'm gone and on.
No, it's fantastic. And I'm just really curious. Tell me more about why you chose beading in terms of what it represents and signifies as like a language and an art from your background, and how people in particular responded to beading as a method of communicating.
Well, that was really surprising, because I am from Alaska, so finding beads and finding beadwork and access to beads has never ever been a problem. It's like there's too many beads, there's abundance of beads, and when I went to Sweden, I just kind of had this impression that it would be no problem. And so it was like a little bit of a hunt to try to figure out how to even gain access to my material and really think about, is this material important? And, beading for me, is a really, meditative thing, and, I don't necessarily consider myself a beadwork artist, but it's something that I learned to do when I was really young, and that I've always been surrounded by amazing beadwork artists. So, putting this stuff in beads, it kind of felt like it was sort of framing all these conversations that were really, data points from everyone in the workshop, within kind of the Melissa, project. So taking this information and beading it, each one of these beaded pieces would take, about, 45 minutes to an hour to finish. Because I was using big beads. But throughout that whole time, I would read people's answers, right, in their booklet, whether they gave it to me or whether I scanned it in, and then I would be using this design to think about, what it is what information they gave me. And so it was very process based and contemplative, in that moment. And so in some ways it was kind of like a bit of a ceremony for myself. Because it wasn't necessarily about the sort of finished product, but doing it was a way for me to kind of process all that information.
And did
Yeah.
you end up giving them, was it a little bead loom that you used? And did you give them a bracelet at the end of?
No, I just was gathering them at that point, because I would do the workshops where I would really just be we would just be having this conversation. And so people would take the sort of ephemera with them, would take the books, and then I would either scan it in, or if they didn't want to take it with them, I would take the books. That was something that I wish I would have done a little bit differently, because there was a few times where I had workshops with a lot of young people, and I wish I had something to give them at the end. There was a lot of like young people that would come up and be like, "Oh, can you bead my name?" But it wasn't just like beating their name. That would be the start of it. But then we'd talk about, where they're from and talk about, where their family is within, I was also over there during the holidays. So I visited a lot of like winter markets and gatherings that were happening within communities. And so I just kind of became like this new fixture a little bit in this community, and also kind of something of a little bit of a curiosity too for people, particularly young people. I went to I'm going to say it wrong. I said it wrong every time I was in Sweden, but Stropens, and then I went to Rund, which are really kind of like immigrant, based communities, and that are, they have the heavy immigrant populations. And while I was there, it was interesting because there were so many students coming in with like school groups, and they'd come up to me and they'd be like, look at me, and like, are you Syrian? You look like my mom. And just like things like that, right? The kids, just say. But it was funny because it was pretty obvious that I was different, in Sweden. And kids are great in that they just sort of kind of speak their truth. And in some ways it kind of brought those conversations with those kids to a different place, and then it was just comical. They would ask if I was famous, and all things, because they were just trying to figure out like why I was there, and yeah.
What kind of words did people offer? I mean, that's quite a challenge if I think about, where I'm from, and to envision a single word to distill it.
Yeah, it was interesting because then there was also this aspect of language barrier too, and people sort of like sharing Swedish words with me, and then trying to describe what they meant. Oh, I'm gonna butcher it right now, but I'm creating a book right now that has all those data points, to sort of represent my time there and all the words that were shared with me. But there was like one discussion I had with the director of the concert the museum, and his word was a word that essentially described, this kind of like Swedish concept of evenness, and kind of everyone feeling even, and we had so many like long conversations about sort of, social welfare and, kind of like a society that's based in sort of this social equality, and the sort of differences that we experience in America between Sweden, but then there's also this sort of very rugged individualism in Sweden, with just the way people kind of, gather together, that people like really, really are within their families, and that was interesting. It felt like I would kind of have these moments where I would have these kind of intense conversations with people about themselves, and I'd always wonder after, I'm like, I hope that resonated, I hope that made sense or felt good for that person. But then a week later, they would reach out to me and invite me to their home in the countryside, and then I would stay all weekend, and I think that was a real something that was very similar between Swedish culture and Alaskan culture, particularly indigenous culture in Alaska, is this visiting culture and this sort of like, well, actually, let's take the time to get to know each other. Let's take the time to discuss and to go for a walk and sit around a fire, and to have fika, which is like the coffee and cake time, that happens 3 times a day in Sweden.
Do you have some more images of some of these interactive, hands-on kinds of
I
workshops that
I
you might
do.
have?
So here's just a few with little kids, So I don't have any photos of. I should have put a photo in here, but I was also had a partner artist while I was in Sweden, named Dano, and he ran this gallery in Falköpings, which was like a city 17 minutes by train away from Lövda, and it was really nice kind of to have another sort of base to go to and to get to know a little bit. And he worked with the school district, out there. And so I got to visit a few times, their class. And you see here, I'm doing this little loom beadwork with the kids around me, around the sort of words that they selected. There was words like here is one of the young people's names, right? And then this name, Somalia. People had all different sorts of words that they wanted to share, right? Some would be very kind of like they would actually want you to record the name of where they're from, or they'd want you to record, I think this one is like Knifekin, which means curious in Swedish, so it was a whole array of different things. And yeah, it was wonderful. It was really wonderful.
You've described your process as kind of becoming like conversation based as an
Hmm.
artist, and
Yeah.
you talk about what you're learning, you're taking with you from that time. It seemed like these in here we're looking at like the little bead project that says Somalia, place-based connections. You've talked about how place-based connections seemed more true, to the nature of those interactions you had there in Sweden as they do customarily, rather than the kind of Western ideas of hierarchy and job title as a basis of connecting.
Yeah, well, we would have discussions, and people would be like, well, do I talk about Wevda like here, or would I talk about, like where I'm from, or, what I consider home, right? And then even that is another jumping off point, well, what's the difference between where you are right now and then where you consider where you're from? It's like, what's the difference there for you? And is it just about sort of like the present moment of this interaction, or is it deeper? I think certainly in Alaska we can understand, the kind of roots that a place can take hold of you, right? And can really affect the kind of person that you are, and certainly affects the kind of artist that I am. So it was interesting having the conversation of, well, what does this make you think of, right? And a lot of these young students, there was one student who, they're like, well, when I think of Somalia, I just think of my grandparents. Can I just put my grandma is the word? And I'm like, yes, you can, right? And so it kind of ends up being this kind of like, abstract, kind of data point. But in so many ways, it's kind of like this kind of momentary thing, right? And it's sort of marking time in a way that would just sort of fade away had I not been doing a project like this, right? And I think often too, like, well, what if I just continued to be a painter, and that's the kind of artist I decided to be, and that was what my residency was about. It kind of like hurts my heart to think that I would miss out on all those moments, because I think in some ways it helps sort of solidify, my own sort of answers, when I think about trying to be a good guest in a place and really understand it on a deeper level. It's like you're hearing how people understand this place, and you're relating it to your experience, and trying to sort of like, even within the context of your past and your being from Alaska, how do you fit in within this sort of fabric of Wevda and of really this like moment in time, and I think it's like it's about sort of really trying to understand within every interaction, how you're similar, and how you are related. And this kind of desire and need, I really think comes from sort of my understanding and the sort of development and learning that I'm doing of my own culture. I always think like, why do we have this long introduction? Why do we have clan systems? Why do we have, this social structure? And when I get down to it, it's truly about trying to find relation with each other, and trying to build, that kinship between people, which is like this deeper than just kind of, oh, I know who that person is, and we have the same job, or we have this, we go to the same coffee shop, every day. It's about trying to understand them on another level. And that was something that I felt I was able to kind of scratch upon in some of these workshops, because the conversation, and particularly the questions with young people, it was it would lead to sort of discussions about, like, oh, well, you kind of look like this, it's like, are you related there? Or, you kind of look like my mom, and do you do this? How old are you? Right. And it was interesting how those kind of offshoots, it's their questions about relationships, right? They're questions on, how do I connect myself to you? Not really kind of the answers, which are like, oh, it's like, what's your highest degree, or what's your last name, right? Or I think answers that in some ways separate us, and, build this sort of hierarchy. It's not really about like how it is that you connect with another person, right? So these questions were sort of designed to get to how are you related in some ways, and not so much how you are different, if
Mhm.
that makes sense. I
Yeah.
just drone on very long there, but
Well, I'm fascinated by it as a technique to decolonize interaction, to to build connection, and to kind of diminish the transactional nature of, like, dollars for latte or exchange and extraction systems that have so long defined Alaska, and particularly the way that settler, um, behavior has played out on the land, on the people.
yeah. Well, I think that in so many ways, like settler culture is a way of kind of creating hierarchical systems that separate you from other people, right? That separate that. Essentially, it's like, how can you build yourself up, build your wealth, build your importance that's higher than someone else, rather than how do I build relationships so I'm deeply connected to the people that's around me, And I think that for me, a big part of what I wanted to do in Levda was to, I think, remove the sort of mysticism of, this is the artist from Alaska and they're different and interesting and all this. It's like, actually, we're quite closely related when we get down to it. And, how do we hinge this interaction on how we're connected and how we're similar, rather than how we're different,
Mhm.
and for me, that's a really gentle way of kind of like having an allegiance, right? And using, this small power that I had in this moment as the artist in residence, to bring people in and to make them feel, maybe some comfort within the museum that I was in, or to have, a deeper interaction at this, winter festival thing, or maybe, maybe have the chance to talk about themselves within the context of being in a gallery, right? Because I think in so many ways, it's sort of like what I love, and also I think what helps, what I love and hate about museums and about galleries is that, that there is this distance that's created, right? Where you walk in, and this feels like a very sort of hierarchical system where you see these beautiful paintings on the wall that have been selected, and that they are, somehow separate and perhaps better than you. It's like, well, what if we turn that space into being like the actually, we all kind of are on an equal footing, and that, the same paintings on the wall, or the artist in residence is the same as you are, there was some interactions too where I would be in the gallery during my workshops, and a young woman came up to me, and she just wanted to see what I was doing, because oftentimes if it was a quiet day, I would just be beading alone, right? And we were just talking and just having a chat about what I was doing there, and kind of like the words that I was gathering, and sort of the data, and how I was kind of like softly doing research on Wevda and the community, and and she's just like, oh well, I just had a really hard day. She's like, I don't want to disturb you or anything. I was like, no. I was like, sit down. I was like, do you want to learn to bead? You can, do you want to, it's really easy. I'll show you how to do this on the loom. And then we had this like interaction and exchanged numbers, and we're able to, talk after that, where it's just like, I think that not having the sort of beads and this sort of intention of knowing people in that moment, and trying to, your whole intention being that I want to build relationship with whoever kind of gives me the permission to, it would have just passed by, and she might not have ever spoke to anybody about that bad day, right? Who knows? That's a very small thing, but it means something to me, and I hope means something to her. And I don't know. I think that those small things are important, and it's really not about it's not about creating anything that's meant to sort of like be above the rest. It's about the sort of interaction, and trying to have a really authentic one.
Would you say that that's an aspect, a cultural kind of view and practice that's really one of the most important aspects of your background to you, that there's a certain incomparable, quality that you really want to see more of in the world, a way in which you met, with your aunties around a table, for example? Or...
Yeah, I think that we are moving more and more away from that, more and more away from this sort of meaningful interactions into sort of false interactions, or even kind of like the hierarchy of any sort of art world thing or art market thing, right? It's that we want to that we create space, in order to legitimize, or to have this sort of special standing, right? And
value.
yeah, exactly. And but how do you through art, and I think through visual things, uh, keep that importance, and keep that importance of interacting with people on like a deeper relationship basis, the sort of heart of what you're doing, um, I think that that if you keep that kind of goal within what it is that you're doing. I mean, for me, it's like I had so many ideas for the residency that I could have done anything. But for me, like the whole sort of center around it was that I wanted to have, meaningful interactions, and that I wanted to meet people, and I wanted them to tell me about Wevda. I didn't want to, come in with any sort of impressions. I didn't want to come in with, with an experience that, because I know that like sort of momentary experiences of tourists essentially are not truly like what a place is. And because I always feel that way about Alaska, and about when I see outside artists making art about Alaska, or having some sort of commentary or thought about who we are, and that always bothers me, because I think about like what message is going out there, right? And so for me, going to Wevda, my whole sort of goal was that I was going to go there, and that I was going to research and have some data collection that was based on what people decided to share with me. And the sort of pragmatic way of doing that was to find some kind of method in order to make them comfortable enough to share. And the pamphlets, the conversation sort of in the fill in the blank Mad Lib style, and then also really the kind of beads and sort of doing beads in front of people, beading in front of people. It invites people in this kind of gentle way, and then you can have that conversation and that interaction, right? Because anyone who's like beading in the middle of a gallery, someone's going to walk by and be a little curious, right? And sort of kind of using that as sort of the way in.
And I'm curious about how it went over in, at the museum. I wonder, if museums there, like here, are trying to decolonize in the sense of creating more accessibility and approachability, more, ranges of ages and class and experience coming through the museum and feeling like it's their place.
Yeah, I think that they're really working. So they have this thing in Sweden that are called Kulturhus. They're culture houses, and they're usually a combination of a library, a museum, and a concert hall of some sort. And so they're all housed together. It's like this cultural center, and it's all like free to go in. Obviously, the concerts I'm sure cost and all that, but there's sort of like this accessibility, and then also this, just like us, I think, are working to decolonize through many different ways, right? It seems like in WEFTA that sort of their first goal was that they were going to be doing a lot of sort of language and trying to make sure that there was many different languages represented within the museum. And I think that work is ongoing. And I think another aspect too was to bring, this social practice residency. I heard oftentimes that in WEFTA, that it can kind of be considered this sort of island, and part of like the museum's goals was to bring interesting artists from other places, who had I think a social practice like mine, that was based in understanding people and knowing people, and that kind of like deep work of building allegiances that way. So I think that they also are working on, they have their own colonial story in Sweden, and I don't presume to speak for that at all, but while we were over there, the biannual, their whole theme for the last 4 years has been, about colonization, and about sort of like Sweden contending with whatever role that they had within colonization of North America, of many things. So it was interesting being there and seeing artwork that was speaking to that, because that was something that that just always floored me, because that's just something I'm so interested in, was kind of like the age of the place, right? It is, I mean, every place is old. Alaska's old, right? We kind of get into this, we've talked about this fallacy that Alaska is a very new place, a brand new place for people to come to, and it's not. It's a very old place. But there's like this sort of feeling in Sweden that that there's like this ancient history, and something I really appreciated with at least what was shared with me was that in Sweden, things like rune stones that are from the 12th century are left in the place that they were created in, that they were left there because that's where they're supposed to be, and also something like the I'm going to butcher it, but Allemans Lud, which is like all man's law, meaning that sort of nature belongs to everyone. There's a certain extent to that, right? Because then there's complexities, particularly with like the Sami people just within like the last 10 years, like being given indigenous status by the United Nations, right? There's a lot of history and complex sort of like colonization and assimilative practices that happen in Sweden. But there were perspectives like that though, that I would have these sort of like deeper conversations with people that I don't think I would have had I shown any other type of work, that I hadn't done work that was about, I'm here to kind of learn about who you are, and about what stewardship means to you. The whole second half of that pamphlet was all about stewardship and all about, who I asked people, who are the indigenous people of a place, right? And I got all sorts of answers, because I think people are still kind of defining, trying to define, what indigenous peoples even mean in Sweden. I mean, it's only, I think, 2013 that I think I'm right on that, but 2013 that Sami people had gotten indigenous status, right? So it's still somewhat of a new thing for Swedish people, right? At least in mainstream media things. But yeah, it was also interesting too that I would I made a point to try to be more active on my social medias while I was over there, and I would anytime I would see something that was Sami, is that I would spend a lot of time with the label copy and with things that were sort of written about Sami people, and I had posted a few of them on my stories, and luckily, and I think to it was I had Sami people reach out to me, and express to me when they felt that my assessment of those things was off, and then we would have this conversation of why the curation at this moment was not quite in line with the way Sami people were living or feeling about these things, and that was also another practice of me kind of, I feel like, being my full self in a place, and I think creating work and dealing with concepts where I didn't feel like I had much of anybody there who understood me, right? And so it's talking about these things that feel so specific and so at least touched upon in Alaska, that when I'm kind of working through those thoughts and those ideas in Sweden, it was surprising to me when I was off, or when I wasn't quite fitting in, and I think that that's maybe just residency growing pains, is that you kind of like move through the kind of work that you make and the kind of artist that you are, and kind of assess those things because you're in a new place. And so everything, it's almost like this moment where it's like, can you reinvent yourself, or can you really kind of just sit with who you are and what you do, and really deeply assess it, and think about it. And for me, that's what I tried to do the whole time. So
Fascinating. I'm thinking about how much the residency model has shifted to, but really expanded with social practice, and especially with the conversation-based practice, as you described, around building, rapport and connection with people.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
how how does it relate to ideas of wealth and social standing customarily, to shift the nature of your exchange into one that's around meeting at, at sort of at a table, through a conversation, rather than in a hierarchical sense, as a person who's, a presenter on the walls, or, set apart in a sense, not as touchable.
Well, I think that within a residency, it's like you're trying to meet the expectations people have of you, right? Particularly because you're there, and sort of all the eyes are on you, and they're trying to sort of assess, why you're there, and what sort of things you have to kind of like leave behind, and is it even interesting or of value to that community, right? You kind of go through this kind of like checklist of whether or not what you're doing feels valid or feels relevant, right? And I think that in some ways, when I kept returning to that, this is about research, this is about data collection, this is about, trying to leave this experience with like a really authentic and multifaceted perspective on Huevda and Sweden. I just try to keep to always like return to that, was that, that I was here to kind of absorb all of these things, and within the sort of the context of myself as an artist and as Melissa, how do I sort of hold on to that information and honor it, back? What kind of work can I do to honor that back, and to honor all that was shared with me and given to me, right? Because it truly was a gift, all those moments. And for me, it was about beating all these words, but then it was about kind of, expanding that. After the first few weeks, I kind of like moved away from beating even the words, and it turned into me kind of like creating sort of large pieces that held on to things, or that represented something from my culture, from my Ahtna culture, into beads, and, into this kind of like, tactile thing that became kind of the material of this residency for me, which was beading, because it was also something that you could do in, while you were having coffee with somebody. It's like I just ended up bringing it with me everywhere, or when I was invited to Berith, Berith, the artist who's going to be coming to Homework very soon, just like meeting her neighbors and being in her studio with her daughter, and I'm just beading for hours on end as we're just having conversations about anything, right? And I ended up making this belt that, that looks like a baby belt, actually, as I kind of step back from it, and thinking, well, what do I do with this, right? And then the next thing I do is like I want to, bead a kerchief, right? Bead this other sort of like material thing that you wear, and that kind of holds back your hair, just like, a baby belt holds onto a baby or something important, and it kind of started to move into more, physical things for me, physical kind of like beaded textiles or sculptures, that I actually ended up, doing another sort of subset of a project right before I left, which was, taking photographs of all these objects, these beaded objects, circling, trees or fence posts, or, laying them on, a spruce boughs that were in the park, and in some ways kind of like leaving my mark on Huevda. It was just like the last 2 days that I was there that I started this little photo project, because I wanted to leave something behind, but like something gentle, and really was just kind of about that moment again, of these beads, these beaded pieces that I created. So I'll go ahead and share those right now. But so these are some photos that I did. So in my little courtyard where I was living, there's this tree that was just in the middle, a very old, beautiful tree. And so this kerchief that I created out of beads, I started just wrapping it around things as I walked around Huevda, just my little suburb neighborhood. Well, I guess I wasn't really in a suburb, but my little like apartment neighborhood I was in. Placing the belt on things, wrapping it around things, kind of in this like, almost like, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, oh my gosh, am I like this colonial person, like leaving a flag? And I mean, like I had a moment there and I took it away, and so it felt like it was me just trying to kind of like leave a little memory, there. and they love to at some point go back and maybe do this over a summer and actually bead these things onto trees and onto fence posts and to kind of leave them in some way. This is actually a mural done by one of with kids with the partner artist I worked with, Dane. And then here you can, it's kind of camouflaged in here,
Ah,
right? Another thing I wanted to do, but my hide didn't come in. That was the other thing, is the materials could be hard. I had a moose hide that was coming my way, and now it's just like stuck in Sweden and will be sent back eventually. But I wanted to make little belts out of all the words. This was sort of like the final hour, and I was like, oh, wouldn't that be great if I did this also with the beaded words that I did, because I ended up with like 20 of them, by the end. But then there was also kind of like this experience of having, I think residencies give you a lot of quiet time. And I was provided with like the most beautiful studio and, place to live in Sweden. And there was something just like very, very, that felt very like out of place but comfortable, with all my beads that I brought with me. And so I started to just kind of like take these photos of my beads in my apartment. And yeah, I think that this is something that I'll probably continue to develop, you know. Uh, but
wow. So as their hour together just draws to a close, I've got one more question that I'm thinking about. Wonder what you feel about culture and how you know it seems like in a sense you're evolving culture and living it and and inventing too, and there's an aspect that's traditional for sure. It's evident with the material and intention, but there's also something that's really expansive and inventive that you're offering about um, living culture.
well, I think that something I was on a recent meeting that I I can't, I'm trying to remember who said it exactly. Um, but somebody, I'll have to think about it later and talk to them. But they said something about, we want to create space for, indigenous artists to experiment and to do new things. And, because we've always been innovators, we've always been making work in incredible technology, and for me, this new work, is so undefined that in some ways I worry that I'm fumbling through it, right? But I've also realized that that's kind of my process. It's my process is this sort of doing and kind of taking risks and doing it in a way that's sort of upfront about my learning and upfront about me creating kind of in public, in front of everyone, and watching that shift and being okay with that shift. I think indigenous people, I think in particular, were very accustomed to only presenting things when they're kind of perfect, and they're so worked out and so completely finished because we have to meet that level in ways that non-native artists don't have to, and so we don't always show that kind of messiness, of what we do. And I think in some ways that sort of mindset has been arresting for me, of having to sort of try to be perfect and all those things, because I think really like the revelation of creating is to sort of do these things and to have some things really work, and then other things you end up kind of like gradually letting go of, and moving on from. So for me, creating something new and having this time in the residency, has kind of just sort of bolstered that sort of bravery, is that I want to continue to create kind of in public and, in process, because I think ultimately that if I continue on this path of just trying to be really thoughtful with every sort of step I take, that I can't really fail at it. So I don't know. Maybe that's naive. Maybe anyone can fail, but I don't. I think that I'm just going to kind of keep trying to make this way, and hopefully it will continue to resonate.
All right. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Yeah. Thank you.